Awesome. How's everybody doing today? Pretty good, pretty good. Cool. So it's 1:30, so we're going to get going. There might be people who wander in and out during the lecture. We'll just hope to not make a big deal out of it. Awesome. Yeah, I'm Kyle Cheesewright, College of Idaho. I'm here to talk to you all about critical race theory. Critical race theory is pretty interesting, pretty intense. Yeah, hopefully we all learn a bunch. Awesome. Let's start off by talking a little bit about what critical race theory is, right? So critical race theory is basically a collective of activists and scholars, often, and in the early days particularly, located in the legal field, that investigate questions that involve race, racism, and power in society, right? So critical race theory is one of those things that I would call a perspective when I'm talking about critical theory generally, right? It draws a particular, it takes a particular lens and applies that to social phenomena. Under this understanding, right, anything is basically going to be, you can analyze anything using a critical race theory lens. It just asks you to emphasize particular characteristics. Come on in, don't worry about it. It just asks you to emphasize particular characteristics and particular issues while you're conducting analysis. So, while critical race theory originated in legal studies, right, it was particularly a bunch of lawyers, primarily out of Harvard, who first started advocating and creating the body that's come to be known as critical race theory. It has spread throughout a variety of other disciplines. You see a lot of people doing critical race theory in education in particularly. That was one of the first fields that really picked up the insights of critical race theory and started to apply them to a variety of different processes. Probably because, right, a lot of early critical race work revolved around the integration debates that the United States was having, particularly stuff that was going on in the 60s, right? So like school desegregation was a particularly large concern of the legal scholars who were doing critical race theory, which made it a pretty logical leap into education and the way that we talk about how to train or how to teach each other. It's also spread into political science. Ethnic studies draws on a lot of the insights of critical race theory, though it's important to note that ethnic studies in critical race theory are not isomorphic, i.e. they don't sit directly on top of one another and it's like, oh yeah, all the same insights. Not by a long shot. We're talking about very different bodies of work, though a lot of folks will bring critical race theory lenses to ethnic studies discussions. You also see it happening in philosophy. Communication studies recently has had a large leap. I was lucky enough to take one of the first seminars at the graduate level in critical race theory from Dr. Rachel Griffin, who was one of the professors at Colorado State University, who had done it and worked with it primarily through education when she was getting her PhD at the University of Denver. So critical race theory is in a lot of different fields and has a lot of different influences. One thing to note about critical race theory is that a lot of the most traditional work in critical race theory takes place along the black-white binary. It's particularly an analysis of how racial relations play out between black populations and white populations. This is by no means the extent of it, and there are a lot of critical race scholars, particularly even some who were involved in the initial conceptualizations of critical race theory, who have worked to push it to other areas. Richard Delgado, for instance, who was present at the opening convocation of critical race theory, is one of the people who does a lot of work in critical Latino and Latina studies. And you also see a lot of folks using the applications from critical race theory in terms of indigenous populations. There are also some pretty serious endeavors into queer connections with critical race theory. So you see it happening in a variety of different contexts. A lot of these scholars have different insights because the questions that they're looking at are slightly different, though often related to one another. And so it's important to recognize that there are all of these bodies of work going on at the same time. If we're going to talk really specifically about the origin myths of critical race theory, or sort of how critical race theory comes to be, one of the earliest points to really locate its beginning is in 1982 when Derek Bell, who was a professor at Harvard Law, decided to leave Harvard Law. The reason that he decided to leave Harvard Law was because he was disappointed in Harvard Law's refusal to hire additional minority professors. He was the only scholar of color at Harvard Law at that time, and he felt like he was banging his head against a wall trying to get them to hire other folks to come in and do the work that he was responsible for doing. And so when he left, Harvard Law School was not particularly proactive in hiring a replacement faculty to be able to discuss these issues or to make it so that there was anybody of color in the Harvard Law program, right? He was the one professor he was the one professor of color who was at Harvard Law. And so that led to a variety of students going in and starting a bunch of protests surrounding this, trying to get them to hire new people. One of the comments that becomes central to some of the theses of critical race theory that that the dean of Harvard Law School made while these students were protesting there was, would you rather have a mediocre professor who is a minority or a high-quality professor who is white? And a lot of the people got very angry about that because it was pretty crazy and reflected a system of meritocracy that was particularly designed to exclude people at that point in time. Probably still is. So a lot of protests happened, a lot of people started talking about these issues, and in 1989 there was a convergence at a convent. And at this convent they met together to talk about new developments in CRT, or critical race theory. This, of course, was a little interesting because there was no such thing as CRT at this point in time. And what the 24 members who got together at this conference were there to talk about was what critical race theory would be, what it would look at, what types of things they would discuss, and how they would approach sort of talking about this. If you're interested in a pretty extended analysis of this from the perspective of someone who was there and has done a lot of the groundwork on critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw has an excellent article, 20 Years of Critical Race Theory, Looking Back to Move Forward. And that article, it's available freely online because one of the cool things about a lot of law schools is that their professors make sure to open source the academic work that they do, which I think is super awesome, and that means that you can access it if you just Google that, for instance. It is available in PDF from a variety of different sources. And so that will talk about a lot of these commitments and a lot of the history in a very deep, very rich, and very meaningful way. And I'd strongly encourage you to check that out if that's something that you're interested in. Crenshaw has actually edited a variety of anthologies, which are great places to start when trying to get into critical race theory, because it archives the early work and talks about how it's extending outwards. They're pretty interesting things. In terms of the genealogy or sort of the intellectual movement of critical race theory, there are two particular places where folks often identify critical race theory as drawing a lot of insights from. The first is critical legal studies. Critical legal studies was an area of law that problematized the law as a rational, neutral arbiter of stuff, generally speaking. That's really broad strokes, but yeah, critical race theorists got frustrated with critical legal studies to a large extent, because critical legal studies was constantly undervaluing or devaluing the role of racial analysis within their analysis. Critical legal studies is often very prototypically Marxist in a variety of senses, and so a lot of the time people were like, why are you talking about that race stuff? That's not as important as like class, let's do it. And so folks who were doing critical race work, early critical race work, were particularly responding to that sort of devaluation of the sets of knowledges that were produced out of, in particular, folks of color's experiences. Another location that critical race theory, a lot of this sort of origin stuff is drawing from Richard Delgado and Stefanik's book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which is also a really excellent, short, concise, very legal studies written sort of book, which means it's like outlined very clearly and it moves through all this stuff in a very concise, quick manner, which is another excellent place to look at. But critical race theory is also drawing a lot of insights from what Delgado and Stefanik identify as radical feminism, and I would generally identify as women of color feminism. They are drawing a lot of insights from there, particularly the work that critical race theory has done in conjunction with a variety of women of color feminisms, including particularly black feminism, talking about intersectionality. sort of drawing out of Audre Lorde's work, drawing out of a variety of people's stuff. So that's kind of the origin myth of critical race theory, how it comes into being and how it started getting practiced. Much of the rest of this is going to be a discussion of the major commitments that critical race theory generally draws. So the first major commitment that critical race theory usually brings into the analytical forefront is the ordinariness or permanence of racism. What this is basically saying, and it's something that I think is articulated very well recently in Fisher v. Texas by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, when she said, "In my colleague's view, examining the racial impact of legislation only perpetuates racial discrimination. This refusal to accept the stark reality that race matters is regrettable. We ought not sit back and wish away rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our society," right? This is a dissent that was literally written last year. I think that it speaks to some of the ongoing concerns of these issues. But the idea of ordinariness or permanence of racism is the idea that racism is not something that is aberrational, it is something that is ordinary within our society. This is a hard thing a lot of the time for folks to confront, deal with, accept, yes. Makes a lot of people feel pretty bad. Derek Bell does talk about it as the permanence of racism. He has a variety of stories that sort of explore this topic in several of the works that he's written. One that I would direct you to in particular, because it is an excellent read, if a little sad at times, is Faces at the Bottom of the Well, which is a series of short narrative stories that Derek Bell uses in order to extrapolate many of these central themes of critical race theory. One, in fact, that has been discussed in debate on a variety of occasions, including in parliamentary debate by the University of Oregon several years ago, is a short story that ends that book called Space Traders, that tells a story of an alien race coming to the Earth and basically saying, yo, we'll fix all your problems like global warming if you give us every black person in the United States. And it sort of plays out several of these theses using that short story. It's an excellent story, and it's something that's definitely worth reading. One of the big things that the permanence or ordinariness of racism suggests is that colorblind remedies for racial discrimination, I have relationships up there, that's terrible, of racial discrimination only serves to remedy the most egregious forms of discrimination. I.e., when we try to say that what we're going to do is treat everybody equally, the only thing that that really deals with is the most blatant forms of racial discrimination. It doesn't deal with the insidious ways that racial discrimination continues, or the ways that we haven't accounted for a variety of racial discriminations, right? The United States as a society is built on, in large part, a variety of racisms throughout time, sort of starting in the Middle Passage and extending outwards to today, where like the type of infrastructure we have in our cities is only possible because of the exploitation of labor from bodies of color throughout history. It means that when we drive around and exist every day, we are still directly benefiting from the after effects of these policies of racial discrimination. It's the way that we don't really talk about the fact that, for instance, sundown towns in the United States existed up through the late 80s. Towns where people said, oh yeah, you could be here if you're black, you just have to be out by the time the sun goes down, and when people would try to move there, they'd burn down their houses and the fire department wouldn't respond. Or the way that a variety of locations, once people first started trying to integrate, they would have white mobs that rolled around to people's houses and told them to get out of town or they would be hurt. And then once those properties were abandoned, they were retaken by the town under the doctrine of abandonment and then resold for massive profits years later for like golf courses and stuff like that. This is an ongoing and relatively recent phenomenon. A lot of the time, we want to think about racial discrimination like it's something that's way in the past. It is not way in the past. Really, really, really egregious, direct, on-face forms of racial discrimination continued up until the 90s in the United States. And through today, we still have tons of pretty upfront and direct forms of it, but it's also taken on a much more coded sort of format. I mean, it's hard to argue that much of the antipathy that Barack Obama has faced as the President of the United States is based on anything but his race and the refusal to negotiate with him. I mean, throughout our entire history, we've never had a Congress that is more obstructionist and refused to do anything, talk about anything, note any type of concession that he's made, and just continues to refuse. And I mean, if we accept those things, it becomes much harder to say that racism is not something that is ordinary or permanent, right? And these are things that are being documented all of the time, right? Within the past 3 days, there's been Twitter campaigns about things like, there's a particular hashtag that I think is pretty interesting, which is like, if I was shot by the police, I don't remember
If they gunned me down.
If they gunned me down, thank you. Yeah, and it's just 2 pictures from people's social media accounts and asks what picture would they use if the police gunned me down. And they've got pictures of people at graduation or serving in the military or doing all kinds of things. And then the pictures of people at ridiculous parties. And of course, the media would use the pictures of the people in these social situations that do not make them look professional or responsible, and it sort of drives home that message, right? And I think that these types of campaigns are really effective at highlighting this type of ongoing ordinariness to discrimination. There was one kid who used Vine a couple of weeks ago to take videos of white store clerks following him around a store. They're funny and terribly depressing. Do you have something?
Just a comment. I think a really interesting juxtaposition to the if they gun me down campaign is back during times of Jim Crow, when there was a story on NPR or something, when they would give you an invitation to a lynching. These invitations were incredibly formal. They looked like wedding invitations, and they had black people dressed up in like nice suits and everything, and it was this like very formal affair, in which, you know, like it was like they're accepted in this like very obvious and yet very normalized way.
Yeah. What was that?
That's basically what's going on in Ferguson. The entire city shut down, no one in or out.
Yeah, where black African American
Micron was shot.
Yeah, shot by the police, and yeah, it was pretty egregious. They shut down the airspace.
Yeah, the plaza just got instituted.
Yesterday. Yeah.
Where was this?
Ferguson, it's basically St. Louis, Missouri.
And why is this?
What? Because the police shot a black man, like executed him.
Oh, the execution style thing where his hand cuffs behind his back and he's like laying down. That one, or was that another one?
That's Oscar Grant,
Got
I
it.
believe, which was 3 years ago in a BART station on New Year's Eve. The police officer was ultimately exonerated because he forgot what side his gun was on.
Wait, what? How does that even work?
He was going for his taser. I don't know why he was going for his taser, because the videos pretty clearly show that Oscar Grant was down and complying with all requests, but, right?
Even if you go for it, you have to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah, this is all to say that these issues are ongoing, they're ordinary, they're not aberrational, they don't come out of nowhere, and we can go with example after example after example after example to really drive home this point. But I think that it is a pretty important sort of component to start with the assumption, right? Using this piece of information, right, that racism is an ordinary, not aberrational part of our society, critical race theory is able to say that any situation is going to have racial implications that will be played out if one is attentive to them or if one is forced to be attentive to them, right? That is also one of the things about differences between white bodies and bodies of color. Bodies of color don't have a choice but to be attentive to these issues in a variety of situations, whereas folks like me, white folks, can be like, it's hard for me today. I think I'm going to stay inside and just not think about anything, or I'm gonna walk around my life and be cool, and that's one of the problems, that's one of the problems that people have to confront when sort of engaging with this type of material.
So what is her colleague's argument that she's refuting there? I'm not sure what their argument is for.
In Fisher v. Texas, it was ruled that voters in the state of Minnesota, I believe, could say that schools are not allowed to use preferential treatment for racial admissions to colleges. And so the majority said that that was true, voters could stop using this, and that it was not a compelling government interest overarchingly to ensure that schools become more diverse. And that was last year. The most recent in a series of decisions that has been scaling back a lot of the civil rights movements, the work that was done during the civil rights movement to integrate schools and do these types of things, which is actually an excellent segue into the second major kind of component that we're talking about when we talk about critical race theory, and that's the idea of interest convergence. Up here I pulled out the original formulation of interest convergence from an article that Derek Bell wrote for a legal journal in which he analyzes Brown versus Board of Education and the interest convergence dilemma. And in that article, Derek Bell states that the principle of interest convergence provides the interests of blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. However, the 14th Amendment, standing alone, will not authorize a judicial remedy providing equality for blacks where the remedy sought threatens the superior societal status of middle and upper class whites. What interest convergence then from this basic formulation involves is at least two major components. The first is this idea of convergence, which is that the interests of those without power, the interests of black Americans in achieving racial equality, will only be acceded to by the population when they converge with the interests of white Americans. The second part, then, talking about the remedies and the way that it won't work if it infringes on the superior social status of middle and upper class white citizens, is the idea of rollback, which is that even when these interests converge, before any serious transformation in social conditions happen, we will see ways that these things get rolled back and refuted upon, and sort of revoked. We're just like, nah, take backs, sort of like what we've done over and over again with treaties with indigenous populations. When we need them to follow our demands, we're like, here's a treaty. And then as soon as they follow that demand, we're like, oh yeah, sorry, no, not so much, we're done. And that's a long ongoing history in the United States as well. So this basic component has been expanded out into a variety of different places, but I think a little bit of time understanding the specific context that this is written within is worth sort of investigating, right? Most people know what Brown versus Board of Education is, right? And I mean, this was the component of critical race theory that smacked me right in the face the hardest the first time I sort of went through all of this, because I'd always been someone who was like, yeah, civil rights, the courts, they're gonna do it. I had a serious courts fetish when I was an undergrad, and I memorized case law for days. And I thought it was awesome, and Brown versus Board of Education was like the best thing in the world for me. But Derek Bell makes the argument in this book, which is then carried out and more extensively documented and demonstrated by a woman named Mary Duziak in the book Cold War Civil Rights, that Brown versus Board of Education was an interesting time in American history. It's the only time that the United States Foreign Consulate, our consulate for foreign relations, filed a brief in support of racial integration. The argument that Derek Bell makes then, and that Mary Duziak goes through to great lengths to demonstrate, is that one of the primary reasons this is happening is that at the point in time at which we first saw Brown versus Board of Education happening, the United States was engaged in a Cold War with Russia. And largely this Cold War was for the hearts and the minds of the developing world, which by and large is not a white place, right? And so we had diplomats who would come to the United States from these places that were trying to convince, don't be communist. And they're miserably discriminated against when they get here. They're put in the worst accommodations, they're treated horribly. made it very difficult for us to convince those people that about the greatness and promise of capitalism and democracy. In addition to that, the Soviet Union was very effectively using the fact that the United States was monthly, if not daily, conducting lynchings throughout the south of the United States as part of their pro-communist propaganda campaign. And we had no effective way to combat this terrible, from our perspective, terrible propaganda.
In their view, how is that considered a pro-communist, like how did they use that to promote communism? Like,
because it demonstrated that democracy and capitalism were not great for everybody in a really visceral, violent, and disgusting way.
and if they were to adopt a communistic approach to living, what would be the difference? That we would all be cool friends?
That was the propaganda campaign that they were conducting. The United States responded to this in a variety of ways. Duziak chronicles a variety of explicitly and funded by United States foreign policy tours of other countries, of black thinkers and writers to try to combat this. The shutting off of people who were not spreading the pro-American message internationally, and the fact that this was the first time we saw the we saw briefs filed by the United States federal government in favor of integration. Then, unsurprisingly, according to Bell and Dudziak, we saw this demand for integration. And as that demand was not met, we saw the courts do that. And of course, that leads us to ask about this question of rollback, and where are we today? I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the terms apartheid schools. Apartheid schools are what a lot of writers in education are discussing as the new form of segregation. What they isolate is that most schools, it's very hard to find a white-only school in the United States. Most schools that that have white kids in them are diverse. It is very easy to find schools that are 99% black and Hispanic, or black and Latino. This is a new form of segregation, basically, is what a lot of these scholars say, right? And they argue that this was largely encouraged by the way that rollback happened. The Atlantic has an excellent article about apartheid schools in the context of today, analyzing one particular school district in which they were forced to integrate and then given a waiver from continuing their integration processes because they had been so successful in the early 2000s. And over the last 10 years, there's been a virtual disintegration of any type of real integration amongst these in these apartheid schools. They don't have access to basic resources. They're not given textbooks. There's little to no counseling. In particular, they follow one family that had the grandfather of the family was in pre-segregation schools. His daughter went to the integrated school, and now his granddaughter is in the new apartheid school. Worked out all right for his daughter, but his granddaughter is the valedictorian of her class and has no college plans because there's no support or discussion of what one needs to do, or the processes, or information about how to do these types, and applications, this type of stuff.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that, but like another way you see that take place is a lot of the district boundaries and that sort of stuff. They'll just somehow redistrict all the people of color. You go to one district, but those who are white go to another district. Topeka is actually like that in a lot of ways, where a lot of people of color go to USD 501, which up until the 90s didn't have air conditioning in a lot of their schools and didn't have access to good textbooks or any sort of teaching infrastructure.
Yeah. And so, these are the basic components of interest convergence. The idea of convergence and then the idea of rollback. And I mean, there's additional ways that you can look at that. Earlier we referenced Jim Crow and sort of the continuation, that policies during that period of time. There's an excellent book entitled The New Jim Crow that analyzes the way that the United States prison system functions as a new form of Jim Crow laws, basically replicating the Jim Crow era in today, like right now. After after that, we have the idea of social construction. This posits that racial politics are constructed in relationships and through communication. That there is no necessarily biological fact to race, but rather that race is something that is socially constructed. This is not to deny the material reality of racism, which is really, really, really important when talking about social construction inside of critical race theory. A lot of the times people hear the word social construction and they think, oh, that means it's not real. It doesn't exist. That's not really what this means at all. It means that it is constructed in relationship. It may not have biological material truth to it, but that does not stop it from having serious material effects on people. Right? So, an example of this from early society is a court case in which 3 women were arrested. And these 3 women go through the legal system, and the question that the legal system needs to answer about these women is whether or not they are indigenous or whether or not they are black. The reason the court system has to answer this question is because if they are indigenous women, they are presumed to be free, and thus someone who would want to say that they belonged to them would have to demonstrate their ownership of these 3 women. Whereas if they are presumed to be black, they would have to demonstrate their freedom from ownership in order to be free and not resold into slavery. The ultimate way that the courts decide to resolve this discussion is by examining their hair. Asking whether their hair was straight or whether their hair was kinky, according to the language of this ruling, right? This is to say that these things, there's not a fact to that. There's not a truth. And the fact that that has serious material, right, that is something that is socially constructed through and through. And that has serious material implications on the lives of those 3 women. That's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about the social construction of race. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's that it is constructed by us and that it plays out according to the dictates of these systems that we put into action. Does anyone have any questions about these first 3 sort of sections? We have the ordinance and permanence of racism, interest convergence, and the idea of the social construction of race. Yes?
Is the social construction of race kind of like the veil of ignorance that John Rawls talks about?
I think that they're a little different. Veil of ignorance is a way to try to achieve social justice through pretending like we don't know what condition we will be under, whereas the social construction of race notes things like there is more biological or DNA disconvergence differences between people of the same race than there are across races largely. That's the type of stuff you look at when we're talking about the social construction of race. All right. The next major component is the idea of intersectionality or anti-essentialism. What intersectionality or anti-essentialism basically posits for us is that there is no essential identity that exists and is sort of monolithic in any notion. Not all people are going to have the same experiences, right? This is anti-essentialism. And the notion of intersectionality is the notion that oppression and privilege are not summative things, i.e., you can't take someone's you can't take someone's different identity categories, put them into an equation where you put plus signs in between each identity, and then equals out the sum of all of those things, right? So like, black, female, lesbian, white, straight, male, right? All of these things, it's not a summative identity in any sense. All of these identities interact with one another in complex and contradictory ways often. The idea of intersectionality says that when we try to look at oppression too simply, we really miss the point entirely. This is to say that there is no hierarchy to oppression, to borrow language from Audre Lorde in particular. And 2 ways to sort of think about this, or what we're not trying to talk about, are the oppression Olympics, which is something that gets talked about a lot. It's not an oppression Olympics. The world is not made up of oppression Olympics. My professor, Dr. Rachel Griffin, usually called that the patriarchal pissing contest, to see who was going to be able to pee the furthest according to their various privileges and oppressions. And the idea of intersectionality is that we need to understand identity along complex axes, not something that we can simply chart out on a grid and be like, oh yeah, I get it, I know what your experiences are, etc., etc.
Do you have any good suggestions for authors or people that write about intersectionality and apply that to, I don't know, just theory in general, or ontologies?
I mean, there are tons of people. Critical Race Feminism is a book that explores this at some length within the field of critical race theory. You'll find extensive discussions of the concept of intersectionality interspersed throughout Black feminist thought. Patricia Hill Collins' book by that name has a chapter particularly about this. Audre Lorde's work largely embodies what it is to be an intersectional scholar and do this sort of intersectional identity work. I think that Gloria Anzaldúa is another place that you can turn for a lot of this information. What?
What was the last one? Sorry.
Gloria Anzaldúa.
Bell hooks would be another one.
Yeah, Bell Hooks is excellent for all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. So I've got a quick example for you all of what I would generally identify as an intersectional analysis. It's a quick slam poem that deals with the topic of marriage from a queer of color perspective, basically.
Bitches getting gay married, but my ass ain't got an invite. Somewhere over the rainbow, birds fly over the rainbow. Why can't I? Because you're brown, honey girl. I got to sassy gay from the session, not gays and happy with queers and fuck you. Rainbows are nothing but refracted white light. Gay married black people is nothing but a temperature. Mommy, I'm gonna go buy an I'm a second class citizen American Apparel V-neck to go with my corporate internship and some ass. Philadelphia taught me everything I still know about shame, that this queer body was something to erect, that something like a faggot with a cunt only meant I was looking for trouble. So in high school, I laced my shoes with rainbows and preached the gospel of equal rights and pride and teach us that marriage will finally untangle our love from our shame, will legislate us wholly human. But the day same-sex marriage was legalized in New York, D.C., New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, Iowa, it didn't get better, because somewhere over the rainbow there's a pot of Goldman Sachs. We are gathered here today. For richer, for poorer. Tell that to Elijah, who lost his job last year. He lives in one of only 12 states where you cannot legally be fired for having a body that doesn't sit right with your heart, but his job could only be done by a man, and his genitals did not conform to his employer's expectations. I do not know if he won the court case, only that he has a son, and that being brown and trans means being 4 times less likely to find work, but who needs money for bread when you can eat wedding cake? In good times and in bad. Tell that to Tammy Breitslauer, a trans woman from New York who was arrested for using her father's discount subway card. The NYPD chained her to a wall for 28 hours and called her a he-she to have and to be held. This is what marriage means for queer people. As we send the government wedding invitations to incarcerate our love till death do us part. Tell that to Ashley Brown, who had 13 took a gun to his head as if it was an act of patriotism, because in Texas, being gay is a death sentence. It is nights been whispering secrets to open skies and the sound of your mother crying as she wonders how that thing came out of her. And I do not believe that a marriage certificate can stop the bullet. Remember. There's something beautiful about being lied to. Rainbows are just a trick of the light. They make us forget the storm is still happening. When walking towards the end of a rainbow, it will always.
So I think that's a particularly intense intersectional analysis of one particular issue, drawing on a variety of different perspectives, experiences, types of people in order to make a pretty cogent and coherent argument. I also think that this piece reflects one of the last major component of critical race theory that we're going to talk about, which is the idea that there is a unique voice of color. What this is to say is that people of color have unique experiences and abilities to discuss their lives that cannot be captured. This is the irony of a white guy sitting up here and telling you about critical race theory and the evolution of these things, right? It is to say that the types of observations that we have based on our lived experiences are radically different from one another, and that they can't easily be captured or replaced, right? This is why critical race theory starts as a demand that we hire more people of color in academia. It begins from the perspective that you can't put a white person into a school and expect that to account for the diversity quotient, because it's not going to. The only thing that's going to account for that type of quotient is having people with these types of differences speaking to their experiences and saying what they need, and the rest of us listening to them, white people in particular. It's the idea that we need to be able to tell these stories, and that these stories are particularly important, and that we should listen to these stories. I think that one of the big things that comes along with this commitment is the idea that you can't dismiss someone's story or experience because you find it hard to believe. And I think that this is a really valuable lesson for folks, particularly in debate rounds. Because it teaches us that maybe instead of questioning the veracity or truth of something, there are other ways to discuss those concepts, and that we need to be able to listen to these stories and accept things that might be hard for us to hear, right? I think that if you walk around in everyday society, like in the day-to-day Idaho, for instance, where the state is 92% white, I'm not sure about the statistics of Washington. I probably should have looked those up before this lecture. But, right, to walk around in those spaces and to not be aware of how these things happen is a particular type of privilege that comes with the body to not notice it. And I think that that is something that we have to remember. One of the other things that this means is that critical race theorists, in particular, utilize a different way of making argument and talking about the things that they're talking about. Derek Bell, for instance, wrote not primarily, but wrote a lot of fictional stories in order to talk through the concepts that he was trying to address. Richard Delgado has a huge series of articles articulating a LACRIT perspective, which is what he calls Latino feminism, or Latino critical race theory, basically. And he writes those as dialogues, basically, between a variety of characters that he's composed, and provides a very rich detail and back history to them.
What is that called again?
What?
What you just said, where I can find like those narratives. And
LACRIT, you can look up Richard Delgado, who will, who talks about a lot, who does this through these types of storytelling. But yeah, it's important to remember that these are not things that you can learn from going to wherever. And you have to actively seek out a lot of this information. It's not something that you stumble across accidentally. It's something that you have to be interested in trying to find out about. All right. Yeah.
What do you think is like the most preferable form in debate for talking about these things without speaking for others? Like if you want to, do you understand the question?
I think that starts with an interrogation of your own positionality and the ability to centrally locate who you are and why you're speaking about those issues. I think that's particularly important in terms of an argumentative context. And that's not to say something that Alice talked about yesterday in the Equality Forum, that this is about listing off your privileges so that you can say whatever you want and feel pretty okay with it, right? It's about doing that type of work on your identity in order to understand who you are and what type of biases that may or may not come with.
I was thinking like, more like to answer Evan's question, like could a possible route that, some white guy debaters can say is like because the like our system is the way it is, because there's such a limited number of like integration in coaches and in teachers, is that actually limits their growth and their over like well-being and their well-roundedness to understand the world and to get different perspectives, and it actually leaves them. It may seem like it's a privilege or a better reality, but in reality it's not. It actually leaves them limited and small and thinking a certain way rather than expanding that.
I think that's the type of argument that gets made a lot when we're trying to say that different systems of oppression hurt everyone, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's undeniable that systems of patriarchy hurt men as much as they hurt women.
Absolutely.
For a variety, well, maybe not as much, differently. Hurt these groups
I
differently.
think it actually
But
hurts equally, for
there's-
different reasons though.
There's definitely a lot to be said, and I think, yeah, that's the type of argument. It's not, it's the inability to get these types of perspectives. Be able to walk around and say, yeah, I did learn this from this person, and that was awesome. Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that it probably is, considering the literature based on critical race theory, it's also not very strategic to say that because you don't have resources, then it's not your fault that you didn't know these things, right? And I think critical race theory really speaks to this issue of accountability, and that regardless of what your social position is, they're kind of like, we don't care. Like, you could take the initiative to learn about these things, to position yourself wherever you are and understand these relationships. And so I think I really agree with Kyle that it's just, they more fundamentally question how is it different or how are you affected differently. And it's not that like one person not having access is more important than another, but that the material implication of certain people not having access may in fact be worse than another. Not on a theoretical level, but like if people of color in you can learn about this more. They have a documentary called Precious Knowledge. It's all about Tucson getting their ethnic studies department banned. The students in that school who were receiving Mexican American studies had graduation rates go up from 48% to 92%. You cannot, when you're looking at the statistics, like they're just affected the most by that. It's not to say that the white kids in the class didn't have a great time and learn some awesome things that are going to change their lives. It's just to say that they probably statistically at that school had a much higher chance of graduating than the Canada.
Do you have any like rounds online where you think people are handling this in a debate context particularly productively or well, or things you recommend people watch to learn from?
Well, I think that the CETA final round from this year is a pretty good example of ways that teams can critically engage with one another and do that really productively. I think that that has a lot to do with the people who were in that debate round and their willingness to critically engage with the literature and the material that's being offered, right? I mean, a general piece of advice that I would give is something that was actually said in the 2AR from the NDT finals, not this last year, but the year before that. And it was the comment, when is it finally going to be time for people to go into our section of the library? And what that is to say is that particularly in an event like Parley, where you don't have resolutions and you're going to have a bunch of tournaments where there's time down in between, you should get outside of the Google News, LexisNexis research and check out some of these other sections of the library, writings that people are doing, because there's a lot of very lively contestation within and across these different fields of study and and discussion. And I think that, yeah, there's a lot of productive ways people can engage with each other if they're willing to sort of delve through the work that's already been done there.
I wanted to just comment real quickly on the speaking for others argument, because I think that that's important in how you frame this position, but it's also really important to recognize that white people need to talk about racism and about institutional racism, and white people we need to learn about racism and learn about the effects of institutional racism and have those kinds of debates. And I think that there are ways, especially through this lens, that we can have those debates without wholesale categorizing people of color in ways that assume they need us as white people to save them. So a lot of it is kind of just, I think, how you frame that argument, but it's a super important thing, especially on some level, for white people to start being aware.
Yeah.
People should read Colorblind Remedies and others in the debate outcome on this question. I think a really salient example she gives at the beginning is a white man giving a speech that's supposed to be about, I think, woman of color feminism. And he says, I'm a white man, so I can't speak on it. Therefore, I'm going to talk about architecture for the entire right? And this is at like a convention or a forum or something, a conference where they're supposed to be talking about it. That said, I think that it's important when people are looking for these types of literature to also not forget to actually speak with people of color, and talk with people and do this. And I understand that in some places that's hard, and like and you shouldn't just kind of go up to a person of color and say like, educate me about your profession. But like I firmly believe that you are able to learn most about these issues through first developing relationships and having organic discussions about these things.
I also think you can avail yourself of a variety of opportunities at your institutions. Like if there are classes that are discussing these issues that are outside of your general sphere, take them. You will learn a lot.
I also think there's like historically I think there's a fundamental difference. So like the first conference on whiteness was a bunch of white dudes talking about like these issues, and when people of color applied for the panels, they would either not get on them or be like the only person of color on the panel, and like the leader of the panel would be white. And so I think that is fundamentally different than in a debate setting where, for example, you're reading like advocacies out of Patricia Hook Collins. It's not so much you're speaking for others, but that you're speaking with others. And understandably, we all know that the higher education system is marginalized so that certain people are here and certain people are not. And that gets exacerbated in extracurricular activities like debate. So it's understandable that, yeah, there aren't those people to speak here for themselves. But, for example, when somebody publishes a poem, they probably know that somebody else is going to read that and try and connect with somebody else through their voice. So it's nothing more than like using this privileged setting that we're in to try and talk about things that wouldn't normally be here in hopes of getting those people here. To normalize their voice before they get here is something that should be really considered in debate. Like, what is the social condition that debate underlies in? And is that a space where the people who aren't here can just jump in, or do they have to jump in and then create space for themselves?
Just really quick, I think that's really important. I think it's also important to understand that needs to interact with like conversations and action outside the debate space, right? Because that's not a replacement for actual organizing to get more people of color in the space. And reading a K and saying, or reading a position that says that we should like align ourselves and speak with others does not mean that people of color in reality do debate.
All right. That was critical race theory from one perspective. Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. If you want any suggestions or to talk more about any of this stuff, I'm always happy. All right, thank you.